The church that screams at night. When I was young, there was an old, abandoned church on the outskirts of town. Everyone knew about it. Everyone avoided it. The church had been empty for decades, its doors locked, its stained glass windows long shattered. Yet every night, just as the town slipped into silence, a sound would rise from that church. A scream. Not a normal scream, not something human. It was a sound that made your blood freeze in your veins. A wail that carried through the trees and over the rooftops. Some nights it was one long, agonizing shriek. Other nights it was a chorus of voices crying out in unison. No one knew where it came from. No one wanted to find out. But I did. A dare turned nightmare. It started as a dare. My friends and I were hanging out one summer night, swapping ghost stories and urban legends. The topic of the church came up, and as expected, no one had ever been brave enough to actually go inside. "Let's change that tonight," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The others hesitated, but the challenge had been laid. In the end, it was just me and my best friend, Ethan, who agreed to go. Armed with nothing but our flashlights and our phones, we made our way through the overgrown path leading to the church. Inside the abandoned church. The place was even more unsettling up close. The wooden doors, though rotted, still held firm. The stone walls loomed in the moonlight, cracked and covered in ivy. The air was thick, heavy, as if the night itself was warning us to turn back. Ethan found a broken window and boosted me up. I climbed inside, landing with a soft crunch on shattered glass and debris. Ethan followed, and together we scanned the darkness with our flashlights. The pews were still there, rows upon rows of them covered in dust and decay. The altar stood at the far end, untouched by time, its presence commanding the room. But what caught my eye was something else. A chair, sitting in the middle of the aisle facing the altar. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. Then came the first scream. The screaming begins. It wasn't from outside, it was inside the church. A piercing, guttural wail echoed from the walls, from the rafters, from the very air around us. My flashlight flickered. Ethan grabbed my arm. "We need to go. Now." But something was wrong. The air had changed. The pews, they weren't empty anymore. Figures sat in them, their heads bowed in prayer or mourning. Dozens of them, draped in tattered black robes, unmoving. Then, as one, they turned their heads toward us. The screaming stopped. Silence crushed the room. Then a voice, low and rasping, filled the air. "You shouldn't have come." Trapped inside, I bolted for the window, but it was gone. Only smooth, cold stone remained where it had been seconds before. Ethan ran for the doors, but they wouldn't budge. The figures in the pews stood slowly, their movements unnatural, as if they were being controlled by invisible strings. Then, the chair in the center of the aisle scraped forward an inch. I could feel something behind us, breathing, watching. "Sit," the voice commanded. The chair scraped forward again. "Sit." A force shoved me toward it. My legs buckled, my body refusing to obey my mind's screams to run. Ethan grabbed my arm, yanking me back, but something unseen pulled me forward again. My feet dragged against the floor. I was inches away from the chair when I saw it, the altar. It was wrong. The cross above it was inverted. The walls pulsed as if they were breathing. The stained glass windows, which had once been shattered, now displayed horrible, shifting images. Faces screaming in agony, hands reaching out, pressing against the glass from the inside. I couldn't sit in that chair. I wouldn't sit in that chair. Escape? Summoning every ounce of strength, I twisted out of the invisible grip and lunged for Ethan. "Run!" We sprinted for the doors, pounding against them, screaming for help. The figures in the pews closed in. The shadows lengthened, reaching for us. The chair slid forward once more. Then, a sound. A bell. The church bell, which hadn't rung in decades, tolled through the night. A deafening boom that shattered the silence. The figures shrieked, recoiling. The doors burst open on their own, and without a second thought, we ran. We didn't stop until we were back in town, gasping for breath, our hearts ready to explode. When we turned back, the church was just as it had always been. Dark. Silent. But as we stood there, catching our breath, the scream came again. The aftermath. Ethan and I never spoke about that night again. We moved away after high school, but the memory of that place never left us. Years later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched for information about the church, hoping for answers. What I found still haunts me. The church had once been the site of an unspeakable ritual. A priest had gone mad, forcing his congregation to partake in a ceremony that opened a door to something that should never have been let in. When the townspeople found out, they tried to stop it. They locked the doors. They burned the building. But the ritual had already been completed. The screams? They were the echoes of the congregation, trapped between worlds. And the chair? It was for the next soul to join them. Final warning. The church still stands. The screams still sound at night. No one dares to enter. No one should. But if you ever find yourself near that place and you hear a voice whisper, "Sit," don't. A game of hide and seek with a ghost. It started as an innocent game, a way to pass the time on a rainy summer afternoon. My cousins and I were visiting my grandparents' old farmhouse, a place that had stood for over 100 years, its walls steeped in history and whispers of the past. The house was massive, with endless rooms, hidden corners, and an attic that seemed to breathe with the weight of forgotten memories. My cousin Lily, always the boldest, was the one who suggested we play hide and seek. "It'll be fun," she grinned, brushing her blonde hair behind her ears. "This house is perfect for it." The others, including my younger brother Jake, nodded in agreement. I hesitated. There was something about the house that unsettled me. The way the shadows stretched too long in the corners, the way the floorboards creaked even when no one was walking. But I didn't want to be the scaredy cat, so I agreed. We drew straws to determine who would be the seeker. It was Lily. She covered her eyes and began counting, while the rest of us scattered like ghosts in the wind. I ran down the long hallway, past the dimly lit study and the musty-smelling library, before I spotted the perfect hiding place, a large wooden wardrobe at the end of the corridor. Its doors were slightly ajar, inviting me in. I slipped inside, closing the door just enough to let in a sliver of light. As I crouched in the darkness, my breathing slowed, my ears tuned to the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway. The excitement of the game turned to unease when I heard something that didn't belong. A whisper. It was soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Are you hiding too?" My heart slammed against my ribs. I spun around in the cramped space, expecting to see one of my cousins squeezed beside me. But I was alone. Another whisper, closer this time. "Shh, don't let them find us." The wardrobe suddenly felt too small, too tight. The air was thick, suffocating. My pulse hammered as I reached for the door handle, but the moment my fingers touched it, the wardrobe shook violently, as if something inside didn't want me to leave. A child's giggle echoed around me. I shoved the door open and stumbled out, gasping for air. The hallway was empty, but the game was still going. I could hear Lily's distant voice calling, "Ready or not, here I come." My hands trembled as I wiped sweat from my forehead. Had I imagined it? The whispers, the giggle? The house was old. Maybe it was just the wind whistling through the cracks. But deep down, I knew better. I wasn't the only one hiding in that wardrobe. Lily found me a few minutes later, sitting on the floor, pale and shaken. "Hey, you okay?" she asked, crouching beside me. I opened my mouth to tell her what had happened, but then I saw something over her shoulder. A shadow in the hallway, small, childlike, watching. The game continued, but I refused to hide again. I stayed with Lily, helping her find the others. When we finally called the game over, I convinced myself it was my imagination. Just nerves, nothing more. But that night, as we lay in the shared guest room, Jake turned to me with wide, frightened eyes. "Did you see him too?" he whispered. "Who?" I asked, my voice barely above a breath. Jake swallowed hard. "The boy. The one who was hiding with us." The next morning, I asked my grandmother about the house's history. She smiled sadly, running her fingers over the delicate porcelain cup in her hands. "Oh, child," she sighed. "I suppose you should know. She told us about Daniel, a boy who had lived in the house over 70 years ago. One afternoon, during a storm, he played hide and seek with his siblings. He chose the old wardrobe at the end of the hallway as his hiding spot. No one found him. Not until weeks later, he had suffocated inside, unable to get out. My blood turned to ice, the wardrobe, the whispers, the giggle. Daniel had never stopped playing the game, and now he had new friends to play with. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I heard it again. a whisper, a giggle. And then, just before I drifted into uneasy sleep, a voice, soft and inviting, just outside my door. "Come play with me." The town that vanished overnight. It was a town like any other. A quiet, unassuming place nestled in the heart of rural America, where neighbors greeted each other warmly, children played in the streets, and the hum of daily life carried on undisturbed. But one morning, it was gone. Every building, every car, every trace of life, wiped from existence as if it had never been there. The discovery: James Holloway, a journalist for a small local newspaper, was the first outsider to arrive at the scene. He had received a tip from a trucker passing through the area who claimed that an entire town had disappeared. Skeptical but intrigued, James drove out to where the town of Ashwood should have been. Instead of streets lined with houses and businesses, he found only an empty field. No ruins, no debris, just an endless stretch of untouched grass swaying in the wind. Shaken, James checked his GPS. It still listed the coordinates of Ashwood as an active location. His phone's map showed streets that no longer existed. It was as if the town had been erased from reality itself. The search for clues. James contacted local authorities, but they were just as confused as he was. Records showed that Ashwood had existed for over 100 years, with a population of nearly 3,000. Yet, not a single person remained. Even government archives had conflicting information, some listing Ashwood as an active township, others showing it as abandoned for decades. Determined to uncover the truth, James combed through old newspaper articles and historical documents. He found accounts of strange occurrences dating back to the town's founding. People going missing without a trace, strange lights hovering in the sky, and inexplicable whispers heard in the dead of night. A survivor's tale. Just when James was about to lose hope, he received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "I know what happened to Ashwood." The sender claimed to be a former resident who had fled the night before the town disappeared. They agreed to meet James at a remote diner a few towns over. When James arrived, he found a woman in her late 40s, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of coffee. Her name was Margaret Kane. She spoke in a hushed tone, eyes darting around as if someone or something was watching. "Something was coming for us," she whispered. "We didn't know what, but we could feel it. The air got heavy, like we were being smothered. And then the dreams started." She described how in the weeks leading up to the town's disappearance, every resident of Ashwood had the same nightmare. A tall, faceless figure standing at the edge of town, beckoning them forward. "It was like a warning," Margaret said, "or an invitation." The night before Ashwood vanished, a deafening hum filled the air, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Margaret, overwhelmed by a primal terror, packed her bags and fled. By morning, the town was gone. The final piece of the puzzle. James tried to dig deeper, but every lead seemed to vanish just as quickly as the town had. Government officials refused to comment. The few surviving records of Ashwood mysteriously disappeared from archives. Even Margaret, after their meeting, vanished without a trace. One last piece of evidence surfaced: a grainy security camera recording from a gas station miles away from Ashwood's location. The footage showed the town in the distance. Around midnight, an unnatural darkness swallowed it whole. The screen flickered, and when it cleared, the town was simply gone. James knew that whatever had happened to Ashwood wasn't natural, and perhaps it wasn't meant to be understood. Now, late at night, James sometimes hears whispers when he's alone, a voice calling him to a place that no longer exists. And in his dreams, a faceless figure stands at the edge of his vision, silently waiting for him to follow.